Today's Daf Yomi is sponsored by Danny Perla in memory of his father, Ruvi Ben Shlomo Vasar Malka, occasion of his upcoming yard site, and also by Gray in memory of her brother Bobby, her mother Beverly, and her grandmother Grace. So we're going to start today's Daf Yomi as Yevamos Daf Yudalid, and we're going to start on the bottom of Yud Gimel Amabeis in the bottom of 13b, where the Gemara taught as follows. Tanan Hasam we learned. So we had said in our Gemara, we had said in the Mishnah that Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel had different rulings with respect to a who you do Yibum and Chalitza with that. Even though the first 13 pages of the tractate had said, the first 12 pages of the tractate had spoken about how you don't do Yibum or Chalitza with the co-wife of an Erva. Beit Shammai says you do Yibum and Chalitza with the co-wife of an Erva. And so that leads us into a discussion of different practices. And as a result of the discussion of people having different practices within one community, the Gemara is going to introduce a discussion about the prohibition of lo tiskodedu, which really is that you're not supposed to have different practices. So the Gemara brings up that conversation. Tanan Hasam, we learned in Maseches Megillah, the first page of Maseches Megillah talks about the days in which the book of Esther is read. Megillah Nikreis b'chadasar b'shneim-asar b'shlosha-asar b'asar b'chamish-asar. But the Megillah, because there were people in the villages who really were coming in to read it, or they had to serve the people in the cities, or they weren't able to get a minyan on the other days. Different theories as to why, but the Mishnah says that the villagers could read it earlier on the market day, and they could read the Megillah Esther on day 11, day 12, day 13, day 14, or day 15. Lo pachos v'lo yoser, never more and never less and never more. Lo pachos v'lo yoser, never less and never more. So we see from here that they read the Megillah Esther on all these different days. So how could that be the case? So Amalei Reish Lakish Rabbi Yochanan, how could they be reading the Megillah on all these different days, all these different factions of when you're celebrating the holiday? Ikri kan lo tiskodedu, lo tasu agudos agudos. It says in the verse lo tiskodedu, which means you're not supposed to do agudos agudos. You're not supposed to do different sects, different factions of the community. So how are you supposed to have some people reading the Megillah on one day, other people on the other day? That doesn't seem like it's a source for unity. This was, by the way, this was always one of the problems that was Yom HaShoah. Everybody celebrates Yom HaShoah on a different day. So it's hard to be united about that. Some have International Holocaust Day, some do Yom HaShoah, and they move it. It's a little bit like Megillah Esther, and that Megillah could be read on every day, except nowadays everybody reads the Megillah on the 14th, except if you're in Shushan Parm, or except if you're in a city like Yerushalayim, where you read on the 15th. So anyway, so Reish Lakish says to Rabbi Yochanan, what's this go to do? How do you do it? So Rabbi Yochanan says, what are you talking about? What's this go to do? What's this go to do? We needed to teach us what it actually means in the verse. What does it actually mean in the verse? What it means in the verse is the Torah says Moses go to do means you're not allowed to make a mark for a dead body. So you're not allowed to make a mark for a dead body. You're not allowed to make a wound for a dead body. That if somebody dies, you're not allowed to scratch yourself and make a wound. That's what the words Moses go to do are needed for. So Rabbi Reish Lakish responds to that. In Cain, the verse could have said lo tagodedu. My tisco to do. What does it say tisco to do? It's teaching us that you're not supposed to make different factions. Gemara says well, maybe that's the whole verse. It's that you're not supposed to make separate factions. Maybe you are allowed to make a wound for a dead body. No, the Gemara says you can't do that either. In Cain, do. My go to do, if in fact says go to do, we see you can't make a wound for a dead body, and you're not allowed to make different factions. So anyway, the Reish Lakish's question remains: why are you allowed to make the Megillah on all these different days? So Rabbi Yochanan says to him, why don't you ask me a better question? Why don't you ask me about Pesach, where it says in the Mishnah Pesachas Pesachim, says the practice where they had the place where they have the practice to work on Erev Pesach at Chatzos Osin. Now you can work on Erev Pesach until noon. Malcolm Shenagla Shaloah, so it's Enos, in the place where you have the practice not to work, you don't work. So Amar Leis, he said to him, Aminocha Ana Isura. He said to him, I told you a prohibition, which is that Megillah, you have to read it on which day you're supposed to read it. The sages established specific days as the days of Purim. And you're talking to me about a custom, whether or not you're supposed to work on Erev Pesach or you're allowed to work on Erev Pesach as a custom. So that's why I didn't ask from Erev Pesach. I only asked from the Megillah because that's a real prohibition. So the Gemara says, but wait, it's actually a prohibition by Erev Pesach, which days you're allowed to work, because it says, the night before Pesach, Beishami says you're not allowed to do any work. Mitzil says you're allowed to do work. So I'm like, no, Hasam, no, there it's not. Okay, yeah, Beishami says you're not allowed to do work, but if you don't work, you're not in violation of this prohibition of making different factions within the community, because there, if you do the work, the person who sees it will just say, you know what? It's not going to be clear if the guy's not working that he's really part of this sect that says you're not going to work on Erev Pesach, because they'll say, listen, this guy's at a Pesach program. He's at a hotel. That's why he's not working. He's at a hotel. It's nothing to do with following Beis Shammai's position. The Gemara says, okay, but here's another question you could have asked. You say, why do you ask Lo Cisco to do about this case of the Megillah? Why do you ask Lo Cisco to do about the following case? Beis Shammai matir natzaros la'achem. Beis Shammai allows, like we just said, Beis Shammai allows the brothers to marry the co-wife of a relative. And if you're going to do that, that's Lo Cisco to do. Beis Shammai says you can marry such a woman. Beis Hillel says if you marry such a woman, if you do even with such a woman, you're over a kares penalty, and all the children are bastards. They're mamzerim, mesil osrin. So isn't that a real Lo Cisco to do situation? How are they able to do it? Gemara says on top of 14a, mi savras also Beis Shammai k'divrayim. No, Beis Shammai ruled that you can marry, that you do yibum with these women, but he didn't. But actually, well, also he ruled that you do it, but practically speaking, they never did it. Well, also Beis Shammai k'divrayim. Practically speaking, Rabbi Yochanan says no, they did it. Asu va'asu. Rabbi Yochanan says they did it. They did it. The asu, and whether or not they did it was bepukta de Rabbi Shmuel. This dispute where Rish Lakish says they never actually acted on it, so that's why it's not a question of what's this code to do. Rabbi Yochanan says they did act on it. So it would have been a better question for Rish Lakish to have raised about what's this code to do. That's actually a dispute between Rav and Shmuel also, whether or not they actually acted on Beis Shammai's ruling. Rav Amar Lo Asu. Rav says they never actually acted on Beis Shammai's ruling. The Rav says Lo Asu, and Beis Shammai k'divrayim. Shmuel says that they did it. Shmuel Amar Asu. So the Gemara says Asu v'asu. So Amos, when did they do it? When, according to this approach that says that they did it, when did they do it? Amos kodem ba'askol. If you want to say that the ones who said that this whole dispute was taking place prior to a heavenly voice, the Gemara in Eruvin tells us that a heavenly voice came out from the Shemayim and said that the halacha is like Beis Hillel, that we follow Beis Hillel, not Beis Shammai. So if you want to say this dispute about whether or not they did, Beis Shammai acted on their rulings was prior to the heavenly voice came out. Well, if that's the case, my time and demand also, then why would Reish Lakish and Rav say that Beis Shammai didn't do it? It was before a heavenly voice came out and said the ruling was like Beis Hillel. So you want to say, okay, that this dispute was after the heavenly voice. Well, my time and demand also, then why does Rabbi Yochanan and Shmuel say they actually did it if it was after the heavenly voice came out and said that there was like Beis Hillel? Then why would Beis Shammai continue to do it like their opinion? So the Gemara says, well, if you want, you could say the dispute was taking place prior to the heavenly voice or after the heavenly voice. If you want, you could say the dispute took place prior to the heavenly voice coming out. We could go into Beis Hillel Ruva, even though the heavenly voice had not come out yet. It said the laws like Beis Hillel. Beis Hillel was the majority. So therefore, Lamad Amar Lo. So according to the one who says Beis Shammai didn't do it, Beis Hillel Ruba, because Beis Hillel was the majority. So Beis Shammai said we're not going to follow our own opinion. Beis Hillel is the majority. Manda Amar also, but the one who says that they still did it because Beis Shammai said, yeah, you're the majority, but guess what? We're smarter. Ki Azlina and Basaruba. When do we follow the majority? When the two opinions are the same. But we're much sharper than you, so we don't have to follow you. I mean, that basically gets rid of the whole concept of majority rule. If you say if somebody's much smarter, you don't have to follow the majority. Well, okay. And if you want to say, because isn't the principle of the majority to determine who's smarter? So, but that's not what they're saying here. You could be smarter even though you're in the minority. Or alternatively, the Achar Baskal. Alternatively, you could say that this is after the heavenly voice came out, this dispute. Manda Amarlo also, according to Rish Lakish and Rav, the reason why they didn't do, the Beis Shammai didn't follow their ruling was that the Nafka Baskal, a heavenly voice came out. Manda Amar also, an opinion that says they did follow it, that they still continue to follow their own opinion, was Rabbi Yeshua, who said, it says, Rabbi Yeshua says, we don't listen to a heavenly voice. We don't care about the heavenly voice. It's like the Tanur Shalachnai, where they didn't listen to the heavenly voice. They continued to do what they thought was best. They didn't listen to the heavenly voice. So if that's the case, so the Gemara continues. The Gemara says, Uman Amar also, according to the position of Rabbi Yochanan and Shmuel, says Beis Shammai, even though they continue to follow their own opinion, well, Karinan Kanlos is go to do Osasu Agudos Agudos. Well, if that's the case, we have this question. We have a question of Rish Lakish back from Megillah, but we have a question here. How could they continue to do it? They're making factions. You say I'm married, and you say that your child is a bastard, and you say your child is a tzaddik. You're going to have two separate Jewish communities. So Amar Abaye says, no, it's not a concern of what it's going to do. Kamrina what it's going to do. You're going to shtei batei dinim be'ir achas. When do we say there's this prohibition of making different factions? When there's two courts in one city. If there's two courts in one city, some rule like Beit Shammai, some rule like Beit Hillel, that's a problem. But if there's two courts in two cities, there's no problem. So Rava said, wait 1 second. Rava says, I don't accept that. Because Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel could stay bati denim be'ir achas. He says Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel is like two courts in one city, and yet that's so. Therefore, even though they're like two courts in one city, it should be a problem of what's this go to do. So therefore, Rava comes along and gives a different explanation. Rava says, "I'm a Rava Kamrina what's this go to do? When will we say it's a problem? What's this go to do? When bezdin be'ir achas, where it's a court in one city, pelag morin kedivrei Beit Shammai, pelag morin kedivrei Beit Hillel." Where if it's one court in the city and part of that court rules like Beit Shammai and part of the court rules like Beit Hillel, but if it's two courts in one city, then it's not a problem. Then it's not a problem. What's this go to do? Two separate courts is okay. So Shema, the Gemara says, so the Gemara is going to. So that's what Rava says. It's only what's this go to do if it's one court in the city, but if there's two courts in the city, it's not a problem. Comes along, the Gemara says, we'll now discuss other cases where we want to know why it's not a problem of what's this go to do. So the Gemara cites the Bryce. This comes from Gemara Masechah Shabbos, where there was a dispute, even though we know that you're supposed to do a bris milah, you're supposed to do a circumcision, it's a mitzvah to do a circumcision on Shabbos. The question is, what about the things necessary to make them instruments to do the circumcision? So in the place of Rabbi Eliezer, they used to ayukortim eitzim lasos b'chavim b'Shabbos. In the case of Rabbi Eliezer, they said not only are you allowed to do the bris on Shabbos, you're allowed to also cut the wood, lasos barzal, to make the iron, to make the coals, to make the iron on Shabbos. You're allowed to do it. You're allowed to do even the preparations. That's what Rabbi Eliezer says. Where so that was different than the other opinion that said you can't do that. In the place of Rabbi Yossi Aglili, are you ocham basar of b'chal? They used to even eat chicken and milk on chicken and milk together, and so why aren't these problems of what's this go to do? So the Gemara says, well, the answer is, because doesn't this mean doesn't mean that they were only able to do this in the place of Rabbi Eliezer and not in the place of Rabbi Akiva? Because Rabbi Akiva, it says in the Brisa, so Rabbi Akiva said that if you could have done it before Shabbos, it doesn't override the Shabbos. So therefore, we see from here that this practice of Rabbi Eliezer was only in the place where Rabbi Eliezer lived, but it should be a problem of what go to do. How could he do it when Rabbi Akiva was doing it differently? Mar says, what kind of question is this even? I might shani. We learned that these are in different places, and we said if it's two courts in two different cities, it's not a situation at all. It's two different places. Even if it be two courts in one city, it would be okay. But this is two courts in two different cities. For sure, it's not a problem. Mar says, you're right, for sure. You know what? It's so much not a problem that what were you even thinking it was a problem? What was your thought process in thinking this was a problem? So the Mar says, well, you might have thought the Shabbos. You might have thought, well, Shabbos is so strict that the whole world accepts certain things about Shabbos. The whole world knows certain concerns about Shabbos. Everybody knows you're not supposed to do certain things on Shabbos, so therefore it's like it's one place. Kamash Mahan. So we see that it's not the case, it's not what it's go to do. The Gemara gives another situation where we wonder why it's not what it's go to do. Tashmat Rabbi Avo, Kiyiko, Asud, Rabbi Shimon Levi. When Rabbi Avo used to come to the place where Rabbi Shimon Levi was the Marda Asra, it was the posek of a metalta sharga. He would move a lamp. Rabbi Shimon Levi was in the position that once the muksa part of the lamp, once the fire went out, then we don't say that the lamp remains muksma machmas iser because it was used for prohibition, but rather he says it's permitted to use it. And therefore, Rabbi Avo, when he came to Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi's shtat, he moved the lamp. But when he came to the town of Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yochanan said, no, that is muksa, so he didn't touch it. So it's the same idea. That isn't this a concern of what's this going to do? The Gemara says, didn't we say that different places the prohibition of what's this going to doesn't apply? The Gemara says, you're right. That our problem wasn't a concern of what's this going to do. Our question was, Rabbi Avo, how could Rabbi Avo have done this in the first place? How in one place did he do this, and in the other place he did this? And the Gemara says, well, because Rabbi Avo to Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi's really. Rabbi Avo really held like Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi that it's not muksa. But he was a respectful guy. When he came to Rabbi Yochanan's place, he says, I'm not moving it. Not because I think that's right, but Mishum Kvoda to Rabbi Yochanan, because I want to honor Rabbi Yochanan. Oh, well, if you're honoring Rabbi Yochanan, well, then your attendant is going to think that that the attendant is not going to realize. And your attendant's going to move it because he saw that you moved it in your own town. He's going to start moving it here. So what are you going to do about your attendance? I told my attendant not to move it. Okay, strange thing. I mean, obviously, would tell his attendant, but anyway. So then the Gemara says, so again, now we're going to raise the question from our Mishnah, because it said, even though Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel used to prohibit certain things, and the co-wife of an Arab, Beis Shammai says you don't do Yibum, and Beis Hillel says you don't do Yibum, Beis Shammai says you do. But if Beis Hillel says you don't do Yibum, then they're allowed to marry anybody in the street without Yibum or Chalitza. And since Beis Shammai says you do Yibum, they can't marry anybody without doing Yibum and Chalitza. So lo nimnu Beis Shammai melisa nashim Beis Hillel Beis Hillel Beis Shammai. So it says that even though some say it's permitted and some say it's prohibited, Beis Shammai did not stop from marrying women from Beis Hillel, and Beis Hillel also married from Beis Shammai. Now, so if you want to say Beis Shammai never acted on his opinion, like Rish Lakish and Rav say, that's why they all married with each other. Also, but if you say Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel Beis Shammai actually followed through on his rulings, then why did they continue to marry? Beis Shammai and Beis Shammai be Beis Hillel Nimnu. I understand why Beis Shammai could at least marry into Beis Hillel's family to Bnei Chayav Hilu because what's the concern from Beis Hillel's family? The concern is if Beis Hillel would say these women you don't do yibum or chalitza with, then they go out and they get married without yibum or chalitza. Well, okay, that's a violation, that's a prohibition, but it's not a severe penalty of kares. So, and that doesn't create a bastard. Ela Beis Hillel mi Beis Shammai, amalo nimdu. But why? How could Beis Hillel marry into Beis Shammai's family? Beis Shammai says, do yibum with the co-wife of your erva. Well, then if according to Beis Hillel, you're marrying somebody who's a kares penalty, and that creates a mamzer, a bastard. You're not going to marry a mamzer. So, according to Beis Hillel, if they're going to marry these women, it's going to be a kares penalty, which creates mamzerim. And if you want to say, because Savri Beis Hillel, they mamzer mechayv kreis. You want to say, okay, wait, Beis Hillel says, no, that's not true. I don't agree that from a chayev kares penalty, you're going to create a mamzer. It can't be that there's no such position. Even though Rebbe Lazar said, even though Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel argue about the co-wives, if Beis Shammai says you do yibum and chalitza with them, modim, they don't agree with the other opinion. They both admit they both admit that you could only create a mamzer from something which is a punishment of kares. And so therefore, in this case, you would have both going to Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, punishment of kares. So under that rubric, Beis Shammai says it's not here, but it is a kares penalty, and you therefore, even according to Beis Hillel, if you were when Beis Shammai does yibum in that situation, it creates a mamzer. Must be that Beis Shammai didn't follow that ruling, because how else could Beis Hillel marry in? Or said no, also Beis Shammai did follow that ruling. Right? So like Rav Yochanan and Shmuel. And so how did Beis Hillel marry in? Because Beis Shammai said, this one you can marry, or this one you can't marry, and then Beis Hillel separated from them. Beis Shammai told Beis Hillel, this is the logical approach from our Mishnah, the Katani, because what does our Mishnah say at the end of it? Because it says all the ritually pure and impure food that Beis Shammai was saying is okay, and Beis Hillel was stricter and saying was this tamei. Nevertheless, they didn't stop from lending the utensils from this one to the other one, and Beis Hillel would borrow the utensils from Beis Shammai. They didn't refrain from stopping to borrow. Now on top of 14b, now if you want to say that they told each other, that's why Beis Hillel continued to borrow. But if you want to say Beis Shammai didn't tell him anything, well, I understand why Beis Shammai could borrow from Beis Hillel. The tumas to Beis Hillel, Beis Shammai tarasinu, because Beis Hillel's utensils are Torah according to Beis Shammai. It's not a problem. Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai lama lo nimdu. But why did Beis Hillel continue to borrow from Beis Shammai? Taharos to Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel, Tmeos nimdu. Why did Beis Hillel continue to borrow from Beis Shammai? The taharos of Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel said were tamei. So how did he use it? So it must be a lab de modailu. It must be that Beis Shammai told Beis Hillel, this one you can use, this one you can't use. Shema mina. So the Gemara says, well, wait, why are we proving from this case to the case of Yibum? Why don't we just prove from the case of Yibum to this case that Beis Shammai told them? The Gemara says, well, I'll tell you why we didn't prove from the case of Yibum to the case of borrowing utensils, because you might have said, well, by a co-wife, everybody hears about it. Nobody knows what's going on with the utensil, but by a co-wife, everybody knows it has a voice in the marketplace. To say the rumor spread, and everybody would know, and so therefore they would be able to marry or not marry accordingly. So Kamash Milan. So Gemara says Gufa. So therefore, Gemara says, let's analyze this statement. Amar Rabbi Lazar, Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel. Even though Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel argued bitzaros about these co-wives, modim shein mamzer, they admit that the only one who's a mamzer is misha isura isur ervav onesh kares, only from a kares penalty. So the Gemara says, mam modim. Who is the one who's admitting to the other position here? Even Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, if you want to say Beis Shammai is admitting to Beis Hillel that it's only kares from a mamzer situation, Pshita, well, it's obvious that Beis Shammai is going to say that Beis Hillel's ruling is not kares. Why? Because Menei Chayav Elavin Kisher Mnenu. Because Beis Hillel says that these women don't need Yibum or Chalitza. Beis Shammai says they do. So according to Beis Hillel, so Beis Hillel is going to say you can marry anybody. So Beis Shammai is going to say that these women who went in and did marriage without Yibum, it's just a prohibition. It's not kares. So of course he's not going to say they're kares. So it must be Beis Hillel, Beis Shammai. Beis Hillel admitted to Beis Shammai that this is kares. So, well, that doesn't make any sense. Because if you want to say it's Beis Hillel admitting to Beis Shammai, he grew for chayve krisusi. This is literally the case of kares. What do you mean he's admitting? So therefore, we have to say, well, I'm Beis Shammai or Beis Hillel. So Beis Shammai is admitting to Beis Hillel. He's saying that it's not a case of kares. And Fuke mid Rabbi Akiva. He's saying, but I say it's not kares. Even I'll marry into your family because there's a position where Rabbi Akiva would say that this person who remarried without even merchalitza is kares, is kares. The Amar Yesh Mamzer Mechayv Elavin. Rabbi Akiva says even though it's just a regular prohibition, it's not kares, but there are a mamzer can come out of this union and you wouldn't be able to marry. So the Gemara says, let's go back to see what this dispute between Reish Lakish, who says that Beis Shammai didn't act on it. Yochanan says they do, Rab says they didn't, and Shmuel says they did. Tashma, even though Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel argued in all these cases, which there's a question, they have like a fundamental, we're not going to go into depth in all these cases, but there's a fundamental difference of ruling about whether or not they're married, even though they argue in all these cases by the co-wives, the two sisters were married to two brothers, beget yashan, whether or not a get was a valid get or not. And obviously, if the woman is still married, then the offspring are mamzerim if she's with another man. But with Safik is whether or not this woman is a married woman. In another case, another case, whether or not a woman got divorced, but then they spent the night together afterwards, whether they intended to remarry through that union. So, or also the case of Shava Pruta, Shava Pruta, that Beis Shammai says you can get married with the equivalent of kesef, whereas Beis Hillel says you need the equivalent of copper, it's cheaper. So these are fundamental disputes about whether or not somebody's actually married, and if they're married according to one but not the other one, then you create this case of mamzerim, because if a woman who is married according to one but not the other one goes out and marries this person, and that creates a mamzer. So nevertheless, when Nimnu Beis Shammai and Nashim Beis Hillel, Beis Hillel Beis Shammai, they continue to marry into each other's families. To teach you that love and friendship was practiced between each other. Love and truth and peace they loved. So doesn't this prove? Well, anyway, the Gemara is going to say that Rabbi Shimon says, Nimnu hein min avadai v'lo nimnu min asafek. Rabbi Shimon says they withheld from the certain rulings, from the certain cases, but not from the doubtful cases. Now, also, if you want to say they actually acted on their rulings, like Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan say, well, if that's the case, that they actually acted on their rulings, that's why Rabbi Shimon says they withheld from the certain rulings. Also, but if you want to say they didn't act on their rulings, if they didn't act on their rulings, amai nimnu, then why do they have to hold back from actually ruling that way? So the Gemara says, "V'tizbara." You think this is a proof that they acted on their rulings? Well, even if you want to say they acted on their rulings, b'shlama Beis Hillel, it makes sense to say according to Beis Hillel nimnu, but mi Beis Shammai dechave krisus nimnu. It makes sense why Beis Hillel would refrain from being with Beis Shammai's family, because according to Beis Hillel, they're marrying their co-wives, the erev of their co-wives. It's a kares penalty, and therefore the offspring is mamzerim of Beis Hillel. Beis Shammai, but according to Beis Shammai, why would we say this? Beis Shammai, amai nimnu mi Beis Hillel b'nei chayav elavin ninu ksher ninu. Why would Beis Shammai refrain from marrying into Beis Hillel's family? They're not mamzerim; they're just prohibitions. He should be able to marry into them. So the Gemara says, "Kedama Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak o nitzcha o tzara atzma." So, like Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak said in another case, where they refrained, it was from the tzara herself, from the co-wife herself, and Beis Shammai would therefore refrain from Beis Hillel from marrying the daughter, the co-wife of the daughter without chalitza. That's what Beis Shammai would do. He would well, it meaning to say that's what's going on. Meaning to say, that if that's what it is. If he knew for sure that which Beis Shammai refrained was only from the co-wife herself, but from the offspring of that co-wife, he wouldn't do it. So what's the reasoning why we said that Beis Shammai refrained from marrying the co-wife? Because he says it's a prohibition of chalitza. You have to do yibum or chalitza. You can't just marry her. But from a suffix nami isur, but from a case of a doubt, it's also a prohibition. It's a biblical prohibition. So the Gemara says lo tema min suffix. So don't say that he didn't refrain from marrying to the suffix elam min stam to modalu parshi. No. So he said what happens was he refrained from marrying into a woman. He didn't refrain from marrying a stam woman. But if that meaning that he didn't have any information, but if he had a reason to doubt it, then Beis Shammai wouldn't marry into this. So the Gemara says, "Well, what's Rabbi Shimon teaching us?" According to him, the main chiddush is that they relied upon each other and told each other the matter. Well, if that's the case, that's explained. That's the first cause of the mission, that they would trust each other and they would tell each other. The Gemara says, and the Kula Rabbi Shimon. It's teaching us the whole Mishnah is Rabbi Shimon. And so basically to summarize, Rabbi Shimon says that if they knew for sure that this was exactly the generation and they wouldn't be able to marry in, Beis Shammai would refrain from that generation, but the next generations he would marry into them. And so that's what it means. But if it was a certain case, they refrained. But if they didn't have actual evidence, then they didn't refrain from marrying in order to keep love and friendship between the two communities. Otherwise, there would have been a huge schism between the Jewish community. Before we stop, I'd like to I'll take any questions, but I want